In this tutorial, I will show you how to create this procedural snowy ground material in Blender. And so you can see here in the final renders, there's going to be some parts which are more of a soft or powdered snow, and then there's going to be some other parts which are a bit more hard and iced over. And then there's also going to be some patchy areas where there isn't any snow, and where you can't see the snow, there's going to be some rocks popping out. If you'd like to help support this channel and purchase the procedural material, then you can get that over on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page. I'll have the links in the description. And if you'd like to purchase more of my procedural materials, then you can check out my Blender procedural material packs, and that's also a great way to help support this channel. And if you'd like to learn how to create any of my procedural materials, then you can check out my Blender procedural material tutorial playlist on YouTube. All the links are in the description. Alright, so let me just show you what I have set up in the 3D space. So I pressed Shift A and I went here to Mesh and I added an icosphere, and then right after you add the icosphere, before you click away or move it around, you can click on the Add Icosphere settings right behind me, and I turned the subdivision level all the way up to 6. And then I shaded the object smooth with the object context menu, so I have a nice smooth sphere to preview the material on. And then I also added some different lights here, so I started off by adding these 3 rim lights to get some bright lighting on the back of the sphere. And these 3 rim lights are area lights, and they all have a bright white blue color and a power of 1000. And then I set the strength to rectangle, and that's a better shape for rim lights because it covers more of the surface. So you can see those rim lights are giving a nice little blue light along the edges of the sphere. And then I also added this sunlight right here, and I pointed the sunlight shining on the side of the sphere. And for the sunlight, I set the color to kind of like a yellowish color and a strength of 5. And then to get more realistic lighting and reflections, I did add in this HDRI from polyhaven.com, and I'll have a link in the description to the same HDRI if you'd like to download it. So if you go here to the world properties, you can click here on the color, click on the yellow dot, and you can choose environment texture, and then you can open up the HDRI that you've downloaded. So I downloaded the 1K HDR version of this HDRI, and again, link is in the description to the HDRI. And then if you click right up here on the render properties and then open up the color management, I set the view transform to filmic and the look here to high contrast, and this high contrast is going to make things more contrasty and saturated, and it'll make the final render look nicer. And then also if you click right here to open up the film tab, I set this to transparent just so that I can't see the background. Now I'm also going to be using the node editor displacements to actually displace the mesh. So if you want to use the node editor displacements, then you will need to use the cycles rendering engine, because the displacements in the shader nodes will not work in Eevee, so make sure you're using cycles. And then I am also going to be using the adaptive subdivision. So on the feature set here, you need to set this to experimental if you want to use the adaptive subdivision. And then to add the adaptive subdivision, you can just select the object and you can go right over here to the modifier properties, and you can click on add modifier, and you can add the subdivision surface modifier. And then if the experimental mode is turned on, you can check mark the adaptive subdivision. And then on the dicing scale here, I just set this to a 10 because I didn't need a ton of detail because this icosphere is already pretty detailed. So we do also need to add a material and then tell the material to use the displacements. So I am in the shading tab right here. So I have the 3D space over here and I am in the rendered view, and then I have the shader editor right here. So I can click on new to add a new material, and then I can rename the material. So now that we've added the material, we're going to click right over here on the material properties. And I'm just going to close this tab here, and we want to open up the settings here and then go down to surface. Now right here you can see there's some displacement settings, and I want to choose displacement only. Now if you wanted to, you could use displacement and bump, and so that way it'll also use some of the bump for the displacement, but I just want to use displacement only because I find that displacement and bump just makes it too bumpy, and I do want some parts of the snow to be a little bit iced over and smooth, so I'm just going to go with displacement only. I think that works better for this material. And then I will also be using the Node Wrangler add-on to preview the different nodes. So if you don't have the Node Wrangler enabled, you can click here on edit, and then you can go to the preferences and then head over to the add-ons tab, and you can go to the search and search for Node Wrangler and just check mark the Node Wrangler add-on. So it's built in a Blender, and I'll show you how to use it in the video. And then just one other thing before I start making the material. Right over here on the modifier properties on the subdivision surface, I'm going to click on this button right here. It looks like a computer monitor, and that's just going to hide the subdivision surface from the view, and this will speed up the preview in the 3D space. And then when we're doing the displacements, we can turn this back on to preview the adaptive subdivision, but I'll just leave that turned off for now. Alright, so to start off, we want to create a texture for the snow. So I'm going to press Shift A. Let's go here to the search, and I'm going to search for a noise texture. Let's just drop this here, and then with the noise texture selected, I can press Control T. That's using the Node Wrangler add-on feature, and it's going to add the texture coordinate and mapping. Now I don't need this mapping node, so I can press X to delete it, and let's put the object into the vector, and the object coordinates is going to place the texture on the object more evenly. And then I can Control Shift and select the noise texture, and that is again using a feature of the Node Wrangler add-on, and when you Control Shift and select different nodes, that is going to preview the node on the object. So just Control Shift and select the noise texture to preview the factor value. So I'm going to turn the scale value to a 4 on the noise texture, and then I'm going to turn the detail all the way up to the max, which is 15, so it's very detailed. So that's going to be the first texture for our snow, but I also want to add another noise texture to make some more detailed snow. So I'm going to select this noise texture, and I'm going to press Control Shift D. So Control Shift D is going to duplicate the node, but it's going to keep the wires plugged up to it. And then I can Control Shift and select the noise texture to preview it. Now for this top one, I'm going to make the scale a value of 10, and then I'll leave the detail at 15. And then I want to give it a bit more roughness, so I'm going to turn the roughness to a 0.63. So a 0.63, and now there's more detail. So I can now Control Shift and select between these, and we have two different noise textures. And I now want to combine them together. So I'm going to select the noise texture, hold down the Shift key, and select the other noise texture, and then I can press Control 0. And that is using the feature of the Node Wrangler, and it's going to add this Mix RGB. So the Mix RGB can be used to mix two textures together, and make sure you Control Shift and select the Mix RGB. Now I just want to add the dark values from these textures. So I'm going to click on the mix here, and I'm going to change it instead to darken. And then I can turn the factor all the way up to 1, and you can see as I turn up the factor, it's going to add more and more of that other texture. So it's just adding the dark values together. So now we have both of those noise textures mixed together, and you can see we have some smaller noise and then also some bigger noise. So these are the textures for the snow. So I'm going to press B for the box select and just box select these three nodes, and then I can press Control J, and that is going to add a frame. And then if I select the frame, I can press F2 to add a label, and I can just rename this to snow, just to organize the nodes very nicely. So there's the snow texture, but I also want to make the rocks texture. So to do this, let's press Shift A. I'm going to go here to the search, and I'm going to search for the Voronoi texture, and let's stick this up here. And then I can Control Shift and select the Voronoi texture to preview it. And then I also want to use the object coordinate, so let's put the object into the vector, and that way it's going to place the textures on the object more evenly. And I can bring the texture coordinate out a bit. Now right here on the Voronoi texture, I'm going to turn the scale to like a 40, so it is much smaller. And then this doesn't really look quite like rocks, so I'm going to click on the F1 here, and I'm going to change this to distance to edge. And the distance to edge is going to make this really cool texture here, and it looks like all of these sharp rocks. And that is going to look really cool for a rock texture. Now if I zoom in closely, you can see that the Voronoi texture edges are very smooth, and I want to make them more random and organic and natural looking. So to do that, I can add a texture in here to distort the placement of the Voronoi texture. So I'm going to press Shift A. Let's go here to the search, and I can search for a noise texture, and we want to put the noise texture in between the object coordinates and the Voronoi. And this way the noise texture is going to distort the Voronoi texture. Now let's change some of the noise texture settings. So I'm going to turn the scale to like a 10, and then I also want it to be very detailed, so let's turn the detail to the max of 15. Now it's distorting it way too much, and I don't want it to be distorted that much. I just want the edges of the rocks to be a little bit distorted. So what I'm going to do is press Shift A, go to the search, and I'm going to search for the mix RGB, and we're going to stick this after this noise texture. And then I can take the object coordinates and I'm going to put this up to color 1, and then that way this noise texture color can go into color 2. So basically we are mixing the object coordinates with the noise texture. And so we're mixing these two together with the mix, and then that is going to go into the Voronoi. So now I can change the mix factor, and that's going to change how much of the noise texture we're using to distort the Voronoi. So if I turn the factor all the way to 0, you can see the edges are very sharp and it's not distorted at all. But then if I drag the factor up, you can see it's being distorted more and more. Now, as I bring up the factor value, you can see the rocks are moving around a bunch, and I don't really want the texture to move around that much. So let's click on the mix here, and I'm going to instead change this to the linear light. And this way, when I drag the factor value, you can see the rocks aren't moving around as much, but they're being distorted. So you can see as I turn up the factor, now it's adding more and more noise and distortion to the edges. So I'm just going to go with a very small factor value of 0.05, just 0.05, and now you can see on the edges of those rocks, they look more organic and natural, but they still have some cool chunky rock shapes. So I want to organize my nodes very well, so I'm going to press B for the box select and just box select all these nodes, and then I can press Control J. That is going to add a frame, so they're all now in the frame. And then if I select the frame, I can press F2 to add a label, and I'm just going to rename this to rocks. Now you can see that the rocks are all over the sphere, and I only want them to be in some places here and there because it's actually mostly going to be snow, but there's just going to be some little patchy areas where you can see the rocks. So I'm going to create a texture as a mask, and then we'll use that to tell the rocks where they're going to be. So I'm going to click on this noise texture here, and I'm going to press Control Shift D. That'll duplicate it but keep the object coordinates plugged up to it and stick it up here. And then I can Control Shift and select it to preview it. Now on the scale here, I'm just going to change this to 4 so it is smaller. And then right here on the roughness, I do want to add some more roughness, so I'm going to turn this to a 0.65. And that way there is going to be quite a bit more roughness. And then I'll also leave the detail at 15 so it's very detailed. Now this isn't going to work well for a mask because it is very gray, so I want to make it more contrasty. So to do that, I can press Shift A, let's go to the search, and we're going to search for a color ramp node. And let's stick the color ramp right here after this noise texture. So I can now drag the black tab and the white tab together, and that's going to make it much more contrasty. So I'm going to drag the white tab to about here, and then I'll drag the black tab out to about there. So where the black areas are, that is where you're going to be able to see the rocks, but then everywhere else where it's white, that is where the snow is going to be. So I now want to mix our mask in with the Voronoi texture. So I'm going to select the Voronoi, hold down the Shift key, and also select the color ramp. And then I can press Control 0, and that is again going to add a mix RGB. I can click on the arrow to open it up, and I'm going to drop it inside the rocks frame and then bring it over. And I can also bring the rocks frame back a little bit and maybe push these together. Now, because this is the mask, this is going to tell it where it's going to be the Voronoi texture and then where it's just going to be white. So I'm going to put this color here from the color ramp into the factor. And then I want the Voronoi distance to be going into color 1. So now if I zoom in here, you can see there are just some rocks here and there, but then most of it is that gray color. And this color 2 here, I'm just going to leave it at the default value. And if you go over here to the hex value, that should be a value of BC, BC, BC. So that is the default color that comes in the mix RGB. So I'm just going to leave that to that value. All right, so we now have the snow and we have the rocks. So I want to mix these together. So I'm going to select the darken here from the snow, hold down the Shift key, and select the mix from the rocks. And then I can press Control 0, and that's going to add another mix RGB. I can click on the arrow to open it up and bring it up here. Now I just want to add the dark values. So if I click on the mix here, I can just change this to darken. And then this mix can be going into color 1, and the snow darken can be going into color 2. So then on the factor here, I can drag this all the way up to 1, and you can see as I drag it up, it's adding that snow texture, and it's just adding the dark values. So now we have the rocks and the snow and they're mixed together. So I can now take the principled shader, and I'm going to drop this in between them, and then make sure that the darken is going into the base color. And then I can drag these up here and drag this up here, maybe bring these over a bit. So this darken is going to go into the base color, so that's going to make the color of the texture, but I want to change the colors because you can see it is very white. There's just some little dark areas around the rocks, but I want to change the colors. So I'm going to press Shift A. Let's go here to the search, and I'm going to search for a color ramp, and we're going to stick the color ramp right here in between the darken and the principled. So I can now change the colors of the color ramp, and that's going to change the colors for the material. So I'm first going to add another color in here. So I'm going to hold down the Control key and click right here, and that's going to add another tab. And then if you click on the color here, you can change that color. So I'm going to make this kind of a brownish, dark grayish color. And you can see this color here is changing the colors for the rocks. And if you want to use the same exact color that I'm using, then you can go to the hex value and you can punch in a hex value of 686261. So that is the color that I'll be using for the rocks. Now over here I am going to leave this at black so that the cracks in between the rocks is darker, and then I'm going to click on the white tab and I'm going to drag this over. And you can see as I drag it over, it's making it more contrasty and the edges are more sharp. And I also might drag this over just a little bit. So there we go. So there is the color for the texture. Now I also want to put this texture into the roughness so that some parts are more rough and then other parts are less rough. So let's take the darkened color and we are going to put that into the roughness. Now I want to be able to control this better. So I'm going to click on this color ramp and I can press Shift D to duplicate it, and we're going to drop it right here. And then I want to reset the color ramp. So with the color ramp selected, I can hit the backspace, and that's just going to clear the color ramp. And then I actually want to flip these values, because if I zoom into the material here, I'm just going to kind of go to the edge here. I want the rocks to be a bit more rough, but then I want the snow to be very shiny. So I'm going to drag this white tab over and then drag the black tab over, and that's going to flip it. So now that these colors are flipped, you can see that the rocks are actually more rough, but then the snow is very shiny. I'm going to drag this over here, and then I want to drag this tab over here. And I do want the rocks to be a little bit shiny, but I might just drag this over just a little bit. So now if you look here on the reflections, you can see the rocks are more rough, but then right over here where the snow is, it's very, very reflective. You can see all that shiny bits there. Now I also want to put some values into the normal to give it some bump, because right now this material is very smooth. So I'm first going to add the bump for the rocks. So I'm going to take the mix here from the rocks frame. I'm going to pull out a wire here and I'm going to stick this into the normal. Now you can see there's some weird shading issues, and that's because this is color data. It's a yellow dot, but then this is normal data. You can see this is a purple dot. So we need to convert the color data into normal data. So I'm going to press Shift A. Let's go here to the search, and I'm going to search for a bump node, and we're going to drop the bump node right here in this wire, and I can just drag it down. Now we actually want the mix here from the rocks to be going into the height value of the bump, and that'll convert it to normal data. So if you zoom into the rocks, you can see now they're very bumpy. Now that's a bit too bumpy, so I'm going to turn the strength value of the bump to just like a 0.3, so it's not quite as bumpy. Now I also want to add some bump to the snowy areas. I do want the snowy areas to be less bumpy than the rocks, but I still want them to have a little bit of bump. So I'm going to click on this bump node, and I'm going to press Shift D to duplicate it, and I can drop it down here. And then the normal can go into the normal of the bump. So this way we can mix two bump maps together, and so we now have this height value that we can add data into. So I'm going to take the darken here from the snow, I'm going to take the color, and I'm going to put that into the height value. And now you can see the snow is bumpy as well. Now I do want the snow to be more smooth, so on the strength value right here, I'm just going to turn this to like a 0.15 so it is more smooth. But there is going to be a little bit of bump there and a little bit of noise on the snow. Alright, so this material is looking very cool, but it still isn't using any displacements. So to preview the displacements, right back over here on the modifier properties, I'm going to click on this little button here that looks like a monitor, and that way it's going to preview the adaptive subdivision, and then I'll just make this smaller. So we've already set up the displacement settings in the beginning of this video, so we now just need to add some values to the displacement of the material output. So I'm going to take this darken here, which is mixing the rocks and the snow together, and I'm going to put the color into the displacement. And then it might take a moment just for it to load up the adaptive subdivision. Alright, so you can see it's working, but it's kind of shooting it over to the side and it's way too strong, and something is definitely not working right. And that is because this darken here is color data, but then this right here is displacement data. So just like with the bump, we need a node in here to convert the color data into displacement data. So I'm going to press Shift A. Let's go here to the search, and I'm going to search for the displacement node. And let's stick the displacement node right here in between the wire, and then I can just drag it down and stick it here underneath the principled shader. Now we actually want the darken here to be going into the height value of the displacement, and then we'll just wait for that to load up. And there we go, so the displacement is working now. Now you can see this is way too strong because the snow is coming out a lot, but then where it is darker and where the rocks are, it is going in a lot. So on the scale value here, I'm just going to turn that to like a 0.3, so it is much less strong. So just change that to a 0.3, and that is looking much better. Now if you zoom in here, you can see that it is still pretty sharp and jagged, and so I want to make these colors less contrasty so that there isn't quite as much sharp values. So I'm going to press Shift A. Let's go here to the search, and I'm going to search for a color ramp, and we're going to stick the color ramp right here before the wire goes into the height value. So we can now change these colors, and we can actually make them less contrasty. So if they're more of a similar color, then there's not going to be quite as much contrast. So let's first click on the black tab, click on the color here, and I'm just going to make this kind of a dark gray color. And that's looking a bit better. And then let's click on this white tab here, click on the color, and I'm going to make this kind of a light gray. So now these two colors are much closer to each other, and so it's not going to be quite as bumpy. And if you'd like to use the same exact color values that I'm using, then over here on this dark gray, you can go to the color and you can go to the hex, and you can punch in a hex value of 787878. And then if you click right over here on the lighter gray, click on the color, I'm going to be using a hex value of AD. And that is looking a lot better. So it's not quite as bumpy, but if I zoom in here, you can see the rocks are kind of bumping back a bit, and then the rocks are also popping out, but then you can see the snow is popping out a lot more. So that is looking a lot better. Now I do want there to be just a bunch of little bumps all over just to kind of make the snow look kind of lumpy. So to do this, I'm going to press Shift A. Let's go here to the search, and I'm going to search for another noise texture, and let's just put this down here. And I can actually box select these nodes, these three nodes here, and bring them down, and then I can press Ctrl J with them selected, and that's going to add a frame. And then if I click on the frame, I can press F2 to make a label, and I'm going to rename this to displacement, because these are all of the nodes that we're using to create the displacement. So I'm going to use this noise texture to just add some lumps all over the material. Now I want to use the object coordinates, so let's take the object from the texture coordinate, we're going to put that into the vector of the noise texture. And then if I Control Shift and select the noise texture, I can preview it on the object. So I'm actually going to leave all the noise texture values to the defaults. So I now want to add the noise texture into the displacements. So to do that, I'm going to press Shift A. Let's go here to the search, and I'm going to search for the mix RGB, and we're going to put the mix RGB after this color ramp before it goes into the height value of the displacement. And then I can take the noise texture factor, and we're actually going to put that into the factor of the mix here. And then I want this color ramp here to be going into color 1. And then if I take color 2 on the mix here and I make it darker, you can see the displacements aren't bumping out quite as much. But then if I make this a little bit lighter, it's going to be popping out a bit more. So on color 2 here on the mix, I'm going to be using a hex value of CE. And there it is. So you can see it's all bumpy along the edges there. And that looks really nice, and it looks a lot like snow. So that's really good. So I can now just Control Shift and select the principled shader to preview the final material. And there is the finished procedural material. And there is the final rendered image. Now after the image rendered, I did do a little bit of compositing, so let me just show you what I did. So after I rendered this, I went over here to the compositing tab, and then I first added a denoise node just to smooth out the image and get rid of some of the noise. And then I also added a couple of glare nodes just to kind of make the edges look a bit shiny and make them glow a bit. And then at the end here, I added an alpha over node, and I put this into the bottom image, and then on the top image here, I just made this black just so that it has a black background. So there is the finished procedural material. So thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video. And if you'd like to help support me and this channel and purchase the procedural material, then you can get that over on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page. Links are in the description. And you can also check out my Blender procedural material packs if you'd like to purchase more of my materials. And if you'd like to learn how to create any of my procedural materials, then you can check out my Blender procedural material tutorial playlist here on YouTube. And a great way to help support the channel here on YouTube is by checking out the YouTube memberships by clicking on the join button right down there next to the subscribe button. And if you enjoyed this video and you'd like to give me a little tip, you can also use the super thanks feature here on YouTube. And I do appreciate your support. But I hope you enjoyed this video, and thank you for watching.